At 10:20 in the morning on February 1st, 1943, Second Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, Jr., the navigator aboard a Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress named All-American, stared through the plexiglass nose of the bomber and watched the Tunisian sky fill with fighters. He was 23 years old. He had flown 14 combat missions over North Africa. He had already seen men die in aircraft flying alongside him. But nothing, not the briefings, not the training, not the 14 missions before this one, could have prepared him for what was about to happen to the airplane around him. The All-American belonged to the 414th Bombardment Squadron, 97th Bombardment Group, United States Army Air Forces. On this particular morning, the crew of 9 men lifted off from their base at Biskra, Algeria, and pointed the nose of their B-17 eastward toward Tunisia, where Axis forces were still holding territory against the Allied advance. Their target, enemy supply and rail infrastructure in the area around Tunis. The mission was straightforward on paper. The escort was thin, and the skies over Tunisia in February of 1943 were still very much contested airspace. The 97th Bombardment Group had the distinction of being the first B-17 group to fly a combat mission in the European theater of operations. These men were not newcomers to war. They had been flying since August of 1942, absorbing lessons that no training manual could teach, developing the tight formation flying that was supposed to protect them from enemy fighters. On this morning, that formation discipline would be tested in ways nobody had anticipated. The aircraft commander was Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel. The navigator was Kendrick Bragg. The tail gunner was Staff Sergeant Sam Sarpoulos. The crew also included waist gunners whose positions deep in the fuselage would become the most dangerous real estate in the sky over Tunisia within minutes. These men came from towns across America. They had enlisted, been trained, been shipped overseas, and now found themselves at altitudes above 20,000 feet, breathing oxygen through rubber masks, their hands numbed by cold that penetrated even their heavy flight suits. The heating systems in those suits were unreliable. Partial failures were common. Men who were wounded, who might instinctively tear off a glove, could face death from cold as quickly as from their injury. The broader strategic picture in February of 1943 was this. Allied forces in North Africa were pressing the Axis into an increasingly narrow pocket in Tunisia. The air campaign was critical. Bombers like the All-American were systematically destroying the supply lines, keeping German and Italian forces fighting. But the Luftwaffe was still aggressive, still capable of mounting fierce opposition. Bomber crews were suffering casualty rates that would appall any statistician. To fly a full tour of 25 missions, the number required before rotation home, was, statistically, an act requiring extraordinary fortune. On February 1, 1943, the fortune of the All-American and her crew was about to be tested in a way that would enter the record books permanently. The Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress was, in early 1943, the most capable heavy bomber the United States Army Air Forces had in operational service. It measured 74 feet and 9 inches from nose to tail. Its wingspan stretched 103 feet and 9 inches. 4 Wright R-1820-97 Cyclone radial engines, each producing 1,230 horsepower at takeoff, drove it through the air at a maximum speed of 299 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Its service ceiling was 35,600 feet, though operational missions typically flew between 20,000 and 25,000 feet to balance altitude protection against cold, oxygen requirements, and bombing accuracy. The aircraft carried between 4,000 and 8,000 pounds of bombs depending on mission range, and it was defended by 13.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns positioned in rotating turrets, waist windows, a tail position, and a ball turret beneath the fuselage. Each Browning fired at roughly 800 rounds per minute, with an effective range against fighter aircraft of approximately 1,000 yards. On paper, the B-17F was a formidably armed platform that could absorb significant battle damage while continuing to fly. The key phrase there is, on paper. The reality of combat damage is that it does not follow engineering specifications. A single 20mm cannon shell from a Messerschmitt Bf-109 could sever hydraulic lines, destroy control cables, ignite fuel, or kill crew members in an instant. And on February 1, 1943, over Tunisia, the All-American was about to meet a Messerschmitt Bf-109 in the most literal possible sense. The Bf-109 variants operational over North Africa in this period, F and early G models, were powered by Daimler-Benz engines producing up to 1,475 horsepower, with top speeds exceeding 380 miles per hour. Armament typically included machine guns above the engine cowling and a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. It was a lean, precise, dangerous machine, and the men who flew it over North Africa in 1943 were experienced combat veterans who had developed effective tactics against the American heavy bomber formations. On this February morning, the temperature at 22,000 feet over Tunisia was approximately -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Electrically heated flight suits helped, but their reliability was inconsistent. Exposed skin froze in seconds. Oxygen masks became rigid in the cold. Frostbite was an ever-present threat, and for a crew that was about to experience catastrophic battle damage at altitude, the cold was not merely a discomfort, it was an additional lethal threat layered on top of everything else. The formation approach to the target proceeded normally. Flak was present, as it always was. Enemy fighters rose to intercept. This too was expected. What happened next was not. Before you find out how the All-American made it home, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Let's continue. The Messerschmitt fighters attacked the formation from multiple directions. This was standard Luftwaffe doctrine against heavy bomber formations. Split the gunner's attention, force them to track multiple threats simultaneously, and look for gaps in the overlapping fields of fire that the American formation was designed to create. A single Bf-109, its pilot apparently wounded or his aircraft damaged by fire from the American gunners, or perhaps pressing his attack past any reasonable stopping point, came driving directly at the All-American from behind and slightly above. The fighter was not firing. Something had gone wrong. He was not maneuvering. He was coming in fast, and he was not pulling up. At a closing speed that gave neither crew seconds to react, the Bf-109 struck the All-American from above and behind. The German fighter's left wing sliced into the B-17's rear fuselage just ahead of the tail section. The force of the impact was enormous. Metal tore. Structural frames collapsed. The Bf-109, its fuselage opened by the impact, spun away. Pieces of the German aircraft, sections of wing, fragments of cowling, embedded themselves in the B-17's torn structure. Tail Gunner Staff Sergeant Sam Sarpoulos was still alive. He was in the tail section, and the tail section was still attached to the rest of the bomber, but barely. A visual inspection from other aircraft in the formation confirmed what instruments inside the All-American were already suggesting. The rear fuselage had been nearly cut in half. The tail section was hanging at an angle, connected to the forward fuselage by what surviving crew members and subsequent inspectors described as a thin strip of aluminum skin and the aircraft's control cables. Just 2 control cables, and a strip of metal skin no wider than a human hand at certain points. The All-American had 90 miles to fly to reach base. Pilot Godfrey Engel took the controls. He discovered immediately that conventional control inputs, moving the control column, pressing the rudder pedals, produced responses that were unpredictable, delayed, or absent entirely. The elevator and rudder surfaces were attached to a tail section that was now swinging freely, oscillating like a pendulum behind the aircraft. Moving the control column produced responses that bore little relationship to what a normal B-17 should do. The airspeed of the All-American dropped as Engel reduced power to manage the control problem. A B-17F that should have been cruising at over 200 miles per hour was now flying significantly slower, unable to maintain formation speed. The formation flew on. Slowing to match the damaged bomber would expose every other aircraft to fighter attack. The All-American was now alone. Inside the aircraft, the situation was controlled chaos. The intercom system was dead. Crew members who needed to communicate had to move physically through the aircraft. No simple task at altitude, in heavy flight gear, in an aircraft that was not flying cleanly. The waist gunners, exposed at their open windows to the -40-degree air, were watching the tail section swing. They could see daylight through the torn fuselage where there should have been aluminum skin. They could see the cables. They could see how thin the margin was. The tail gunners, Sarpelis and his position partner, isolated in the swinging rear section, had no functioning intercom and no way to reach the flight deck by voice. So they did the only thing available. They looked forward toward the waist gunner position. Hand signals. Thumbs up. A crude visual communication system that confirmed, mile by mile, that the men in the tail were still conscious and alive. Godfrey Engel faced an engineering problem no flight manual had ever addressed, because no flight manual had anticipated this scenario. The standard control surfaces of the B-17, the elevator for pitch control, the rudder for yaw, were compromised. Both were physically attached to the swinging tail section. Their inputs were unreliable. Moving the control column might produce the intended response, or a partial response, or the wrong response entirely. Engel made a decision that was both simple and extraordinary. He would fly the aircraft using engine power differential. A four-engine aircraft can be steered, to a limited degree, by varying the thrust produced by the engines on each wing. Increasing power on the left engines while reducing power on the right causes the aircraft to yaw right. The opposite produces a yaw left. It is not precise. It is not fast. It is not a technique that pilots practice, because under normal circumstances there is no reason to fly this way. But Engel had no normal circumstances. He had 4 Wright Cyclone engines, and he had 90 miles. The technique worked. Imperfectly, marginally, with constant correction, but it worked. The All-American was turning when she needed to turn. She was holding altitude, more or less. The physical demands on Engel and his co-pilot were extreme. The control column had to be held in positions that normal flight never required, because the aerodynamic forces feeding through the damaged tail created persistent tendencies to yaw, to pitch, to roll, that had to be caught and corrected before they became uncontrollable. Every mile required active effort. There was no trimming the aircraft into stable hands-off flight. There was only the constant fight. Meanwhile, Kendrick Bragg worked his charts and instruments carefully. The course back to Biskra was known. The landmarks over the North African terrain were identifiable. The greater navigation challenge was calculating whether the aircraft could maintain enough altitude and control to reach the runway before something else gave way. Because something else might. The control cables holding the tail section to the fuselage were under stress they were never engineered to bear. B-17's control cables are robust, designed to transmit control inputs to surfaces under combat maneuvering loads. But they are not designed to serve as the primary structural connection between a forward fuselage and a wildly oscillating tail section. Every oscillation the tail made transmitted load through those cables. They were stretching, possibly fraying, being asked to hold for 1 more mile. Then 1 more after that. The hand signals continued. The waist gunners relayed information forward by moving through the aircraft, crawling over the bomb bay catwalk, fighting through the freezing interior, reaching the flight deck to give Engel a thumbs up. Still alive back there. The cables are holding. We're still here. Enemy fighters did not intercept the All-American on her lone journey back to Biskra. Whether this was chance, or whether German fighter controllers simply didn't see a single slow-moving damaged bomber and divert resources to finish her, is not recorded. What is recorded is that she flew those 90 miles without further attack. At some point during the flight, another B-17 from the 97th Bombardment Group pulled alongside the All-American. The crew of the escort aircraft looked across and, by their own later accounts, could not immediately process what they were seeing. The tail section was visibly swinging. The tear in the fuselage was visible from outside. The other B-17 flew formation with a crippled bomber for a portion of the journey, as escort against fighter attack, and perhaps as something less tactical and more human. The men in both aircraft could see each other. There was nothing the escort could do except be present. So they were present. The airfield at Biskra came into view through Bragg's instruments and then through the windscreen. 89 miles. 90 miles, depending on the track they had flown. The All-American had made it to visual range of base. Now came the hardest part. Landing a B-17 under normal conditions requires a precise sequence. Reduce power, lower flaps and landing gear, configure for a specific approach speed and descent angle, then flare at the threshold and touch down on the main gear. It works because the aircraft responds predictably to control inputs. The All-American was not going to respond predictably to anything. The landing gear was lowered. Hydraulic systems, remarkably, still functioned well enough for this. The gear came down and locked. The flap system was another calculation. Partial flaps would be needed for a controlled approach, but full flaps might create aerodynamic forces through the damaged tail that the cables could not handle. Engel had to decide, in real time, with no manual to consult. He chose partial flaps. He chose a higher than normal approach speed, more aerodynamic control authority at the cost of a faster touchdown and a longer ground roll. Biskra's runway was long enough. The crew in the tail section had been informed through hand signals that landing was imminent. They knew what was coming. They braced as best they could in a section of the aircraft that was not fully attached to the aircraft. If the tail separated on touchdown, if the impact of landing broke the last connections, they were in it, and the tail might tumble. The All-American crossed the runway threshold. Her speed was higher than the book numbers. The oscillating tail section, close to the ground now, was generating aerodynamic interference that Engel's hands had to fight through the control column. He held it. She touched down. The main gear contacted the runway. The aircraft decelerated. The tail section, still swinging, still attached, dragged, then straightened as speed fell off and aerodynamic forces diminished. The cables held through the landing impact. The All-American rolled to a stop on the runway at Biskra. Ground personnel racing out to the bomber from the operations buildings stopped when they saw the fuselage. Some of them, by later accounts, simply stood and stared. The damage was not comprehensible at a glance. The rear fuselage was torn open. The tail section was visibly displaced. The aircraft looked, from certain angles, like two aircraft that happened to be sharing the same runway. All 9 crew members were alive. Not one had been killed by the collision. The tail gunners, who had spent the entire 90-mile flight in the section most exposed to the impact, most isolated, and most at risk during landing, climbed out intact. The ground crew began their inspection. They photographed the aircraft from multiple angles because they understood immediately that no one who had not seen it would believe a description. Those photographs, black and white, period resolution, showing the torn fuselage and displaced tail section, have circulated in aviation history publications ever since, because they make visible what language struggles to convey. The official inspection counted 287 bullet holes and structural damage points. The control cables were examined closely. Engineering analysis confirmed that they should not have held. The loads they had borne exceeded their rated capacity. Under the oscillating stress of 90 miles of flight with a swinging tail section, they should have frayed and snapped long before the runway at Biskra came into view. They had not. The crew received medical evaluation after landing. The cold at altitude had taken its toll. Frostbite to fingers and toes, the extremities that electric suits and gloves protected imperfectly. The physical strain on Engel and his co-pilot, who had held the aircraft in the air through constant effort for 90 miles, was considerable. But there were no combat wounds to treat. No one had been hit by enemy fire. The aircraft herself was assessed as reparable, a remarkable conclusion. She was not written off. She was not scrapped. She was rebuilt by the ground crews at Biskra and flew again. That outcome is itself a testament to the men who restored her, just as the flight home was a testament to the men who flew her. The photographs of the All-Americans circulated through the 97th Bombardment Group and eventually beyond it. In the informal networks of wartime military units, they became a kind of evidence, proof that a B-17 could absorb punishment beyond what anyone had theorized, that a crew could improvise solutions to problems no engineer had anticipated, and that discipline under impossible conditions could produce outcomes that statistics ruled out. Kendrick Bragg, Jr. survived the war and returned to the United States, resuming civilian life as most veterans of his generation did, without fanfare, without a career built on public speaking about his experiences. The men who flew those missions generally saw little need to perform their service for audiences. They had done what was required. They came home. That was enough. Godfrey Engel, who flew the All-American home on engine power alone, returned to civilian life as well. Staff Sergeant Sam Sarpoulos, who spent 90 miles in a swinging, barely attached section of aircraft, communicating by hand signal, trusting cables he could not inspect to hold for one more mile, came home too. The story of the All-American is documented in the records of the United States Army Air Forces, in the archives of the 97th Bombardment Group, and in those photographs taken on the runway at Biskra on February 1, 1943. It endures because the photographs make it verifiable. You can look at the image of that torn fuselage and understand immediately what 9 men flew through. No embellishment is required. The evidence speaks entirely for itself. In the broader accounting of the air war over North Africa and Europe, the All-American story is one data point among tens of thousands. The 97th Bombardment Group lost aircraft and crews throughout the war. The All-American is remembered not because her crews suffered more than others, but because they brought their aircraft home from damage that should have made returning home impossible, and because someone had a camera ready when they did. The cables held because they were well maintained. The pilot's technique worked because he understood his aircraft well enough to improvise. The crew survived because trained men kept their discipline in a situation designed to produce panic. And the tail swung through 90 miles of North African sky without falling because the strip of aluminum and the 2 cables were, on this particular morning, just barely strong enough. Just barely. That is the precise margin of the All-American survival. Not comfort. Not safety margin. Just barely enough. If you have been watching until now, then do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single person who likes this video helps YouTube show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are discovering forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about crews who flew 90 miles with their aircraft in pieces around them. Stories about pilots who flew by engine power because the controls were gone. Stories about tail gunners who spent an hour in a section of the aircraft that was swinging in the sky, trusting cables they couldn't see to hold for one more mile. Real people. Real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or somewhere else entirely? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in the Second World War. Tell us if you had a grandfather who flew or crewed a bomber, or stood on the ground and watched these aircraft come back from missions over North Africa or Europe. Just let us know you are here. Because here is what the story of the All-American really means. 9 men got into a bomber on a February morning in 1943. They flew their mission. Something happened that no one had a plan for. And they solved it. Not with speeches, not with heroics, but with skill and discipline and the refusal to stop doing their jobs even when their jobs had become something no training had prepared them for. That is what these men were. That is what this generation was. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure the crew of the All-American, Godfrey Engel, Kendrick Bragg, Sam Sarpoulos, and every man who flew that morning, does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered. And you are helping make that happen.